So in this first segment, we'll be going through the story of how the IVC archaeological sites were originally discovered and how these early finds kind of set the groundworks or paradigms that we use even today when we're talking about the IVC. The story of the discovery of the IVC, I hate to say, comes from a Eurocentric perspective. It's kind of too bad because I imagine the people who've actually been living in the Indus Valley for thousands of years do have their own ways of thinking about these places. For example, the name of the biggest of these IVC cities, Mohenjo-daro, means literally mound of the dead men in Sindhi. And I bet the locals do have plenty of stories to tell about their own encounters with these ancient sites and these dead men. But since we're sitting here in British Columbia, I guess we really don't have any other choice but to talk about how the British discovered the IVC. At any rate, the English discovery of the IVC basically begins with a colorful fellow in the 1800s who called himself Charles Mason and claimed to be an explorer from Kentucky. Actually, his real name was James Lewis, and he was a deserter from the British East India Company's army. So he was actually English, but he claimed to be from Kentucky. Maybe he faked the accent, I don't know. But he sneaked out of camp one day and became an adventurer and spy, all while hiding from his regiment for several years to escape, getting jailed. To me, he feels kind of like an original, sort of hippie backpacker who walked his way all across the Punjab, Sindh, Afghanistan in the 1820s. He seemed to have kind of chilled out with the locals. He passed himself off as a Sufi fakir, and then later he wrote memoirs about his experiences. They're actually really great reads, by the way, real page turners, and so I highly recommend them if you're interested in that kind of early colonial period of India. You can get them on archive.org. Anyhow, during his travels, this Mason fellow, happened to visit a little town called Harappa. And while he was there, he noticed that there were these giant mounds outside the city with bricks poking out at them. It was like an entire city outside of this town. He took note of this, but he kind of got the dates wrong. He thought it was the ruins of a city that Alexander the Great had defeated in India when they came in when he brought his armies there in about 300 BC. But little did Mason know this site was much, much older. A few decades later, in the 1850s, a famous archaeologist named Alexander Cunningham came to visit this site that Mason had talked about, and he found that some of what Mason had described had by then disappeared. It turned out that many of the IVC bricks were now being used to make a railway that was going from Lahore to Multan. So think about that, an ancient site more than 4,000 years old, and the bricks from it are now they're lying under railroad lines in Pakistan. Now, eventually, people began to get the sense that Harappa was a very, very old site. But the first formal digs there didn't start until the 1900s, when a man by the name of Sir John Marshall took over as the director of the Archaeological Survey of India. And he made it his mission, basically, to uncover this IVC culture. He appointed 2 Indian archaeologists to oversee the excavations at Harappa in the north in the Punjab, but also another city called Mohenjo-daro that was several hundred miles downstream in the south on the Indus, and it was thought to be just as old. The leader at Harappa was a fellow by the name of D.R. Sani, while at Mohenjo-daro the digs were being conducted by a fellow named K.N. Dikshit. Both of these digs were massively successful. They managed to uncover this massive, intricate civilization that until then people just had no idea even existed. So historians needed a new kind of paradigm about thinking about this new IVC culture, and John Marshall, the director behind this whole mission, was the one who put it together. Here's what Marshall thought the IVC was like. He saw a lot of striking similarities between these 2 cities, Harappa in the north and Mohenjo-daro in the south, and he felt that they had to be part of the same well-regulated society. He was convinced that as an ancient culture, the IVC was on par with the other two big cultures of the time, Mesopotamia and Egypt to the west. Marshall recognized that this IVC culture was not at all like the culture that was described in the Sanskrit Vedas, and he felt that the IVC was much older. He speculated that it was part of a Dravidian culture, the culture that is connected to South India, rather than Aryan culture. And its decline, he thought, was due to climate change. Now, we'll talk more about these two labels, Aryan and Dravidian, in our next unit. But it's important to note right now that even from the beginning, the discovery of the Indus civilization was intertwined with modern colonial period controversies about this Aryan ethnic and racial identity. Now, finally, Marshall thought that the signs and symbols that were found at the IVC sites pointed to a cult of a great male god, as well as numerous sort of feminine figures and sculptures that he took to be fertility symbols. The 1940s now was a time of great war in Europe. It was also kind of a really horrific racial politics going on that had to do with this idea of Aryans, right? The director of the Archaeological Survey in India at that time was a fellow by the name of Sir Robert Eric Mortimer Wheeler. He was quite a character, though it seems he had some frankly racist attitudes towards Indian people that were popular at the time. Still, he also kind of rocked a pretty remarkable mustache, so I suppose he had that going for him. Anyway, one of the good things that Wheeler did do, was to establish a tradition of field schools in the subcontinent, where he would take the best students in India out into the field to work on digs for like 6 months at a time. So some of the best archaeologists in India got trained in these field schools that Wheeler set up, and so they set great standards for Indian archaeology at this time. So I guess he wasn't all bad. The thing to remember about Wheeler, other than his mustache and his racism, I suppose, was that he came up with a new paradigm about how to think about the Indus Valley. He felt that the IVC must have had a despotic, centralized government which ruled out of these twin capitals of Mohenjo-daro in the south and Harappa in the north, and this was why they were so uniform and regulated as a culture. He thought it was run by a kind of despotic priest king, someone who had absolute religious power and absolute political power at the same time. He thought that the walled, raised up part of the city was a citadel that protected this priest king from everyone else. The kings used these structures to control the population in a totalitarian way. Again, keep in mind that this was while Europe was also undergoing a despotic takeover by a German totalitarian dictator, one who actively linked himself to India through an Aryan identity, right? So again, we'll talk about this in the next unit, but you can see maybe why Wheeler was latching on to these ideas when thinking about the IVC. Along those same lines, he found a site in Mohenjo-daro with about 20 to 30 skeletons in it. He described this as a great massacre that had happened at the hands of the invading Aryans. Here was the proof that everyone had been looking for, that the Aryans had invaded India and violently taken over the subcontinent. Again, just like Hitler was doing in Europe at the time. All of Wheeler's ideas, and especially this last one, actually are no longer accepted. We don't really use his paradigm. But as you can see, I think, how the Marshall and Wheeler paradigms sort of complemented each other reflect some basic notions. Marshall saw the IVC as essentially a peaceful place that was regulated through religion and trade. Wheeler saw it as a despotic ancient kingdom ruled by autocratic disciplinarians, and then it was destroyed by the invading Aryans. So these two point of views have remained as two poles of debate about the IVC. But actually a lot more research has gone on since the 1940s. One of the biggest changes to impact the study of the Indus Valley civilization was independence for India and then its partition in 1947, which created actually two new countries, India and Pakistan, who then have fought two wars and are still constantly fighting each other as bitter enemies. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, if you look on the map, they're in Pakistan, and Indian archaeologists aren't allowed to go dig there, right? So Indian archaeologists place more emphasis on IVC sites that are found in India, especially in Gujarat. In Pakistan, there have been additional discoveries since the time of Marshall and Wheeler, and the tally is now over 1,000 different IVC sites. In both countries, there are now active international and collaborative teams of archaeologists that are working on all of these sites. Today, excavation at the Indus sites now face new kinds of issues. There is, like I mentioned, the problem of politics and the Indo-Pak border, which doesn't do anybody any bit of good when it comes to digging in the dirt, right? There's the growth of religiously motivated identity politics. So in Pakistan, Muslim things are valued. So studying pre-Islamic history can be kind of a problem. In India, the current regime that's in power greatly valorizes Hindu things. So there's a deep interest in India in arguing that today's Hinduism can be traced back directly to the IVC. This idea also is rather problematic, as we're going to see, and it's difficult to prove. It doesn't really stand up. Right? Maybe a bigger issue, though, is land and resource management and funding in both countries. When these cities were dug up, it wasn't really clear how you were going to preserve these dug up cities or protect them from the elements. So now erosion and wear and tear are making entire walls in these cities crumble to dust. To add to it, in 2014, the provincial government in Sindh decided to try to kind of attract attention to Mohenjo-daro by holding an annual festival on site. So there's these media towers and equipment and vehicles and chaos and hundreds of people that all congregated there, and I'm sure it didn't really help to preserve the fragility of the site. But still, research goes on, and IVC scholars are now miles ahead of where Marshall and Wheeler had started from. We now have a huge wealth of information that we know for sure about the IVC as being a place of commercial hustle and bustle, of great networking, and intriguingly also a place where many different kinds of people might have led a peaceful, non-coercive coexistence with one another. So let's take a break here, and then when we come back, we'll dive into these details of what we know for sure.